Hey everyone, welcome to another deep dive. And today we are going to be, we're going to be diving into something pretty wild. Usually we find some crazy thread from the farms and try to unpack it. And this time, well, it's not that
Yeah.
different, except that this time the crazy thread is about something that seems like it came straight out of an alternate reality. Like something that even the Nothing Ever Happens crowd on
Yeah.
Kiwi Farms couldn't have
Predicted.
predicted. The Assad regime in Syria has collapsed.
It seems that even the internet's most hardened cynics were caught off guard by this.
Right. Like, I mean, we've all been watching this train wreck of a civil war for what, like over a decade? And then all of a sudden, boom, the regime just folds. It's wild.
It is truly a remarkable turn of events since the Syrian opposition has managed to pull off a swift and decisive victory.
And of course, our friends over at Kiwi Farms have been documenting the whole thing, with their usual blend of dark humor and brutal honesty. I mean, where else can you find people saying things like, Assad did not fly over my house, therefore nothing ever happens?
Yeah.
Right alongside serious analysis of like HTS military strategy.
It's a fascinating mix, the absurd and the insightful.
Absolutely. Speaking of insightful, maybe you could give us some context here. For those who might not be totally up to speed on the whole Syrian civil war thing, like who are the major players and all that?
Certainly. So the Syrian civil war, as you mentioned, has been going on for over a decade. It started back in 2011 as part of the Arab Spring uprisings. What began as peaceful protests against the Assad regime quickly escalated into a full-blown armed conflict.
And of course, Assad is the dictator who's been clinging to power all this time.
Well, not so much clinging anymore, it seems. But yes, Bashar al-Assad. He inherited the presidency from his father, Hafez al-Assad, back in 2000, continuing a family dynasty that's been in place for decades. The Assad regime has been characterized by authoritarianism, repression, widespread human rights abuses.
Yeah, so not exactly the kind of guy you want to invite over for like, tea and crumpets.
Perhaps not. And on the other side of the conflict, you have a very complex and fragmented opposition, with a wide range of groups fighting against the regime. These include secular rebels, Islamist factions, Kurdish militias, you name it.
A real mixed bag.
You could say that.
And somewhere in that mix is Hayat Tahrir al-Sham, or HTS, the group that seems to have emerged as like the top dog in the opposition.
That's correct. HTS is a particularly interesting case. They evolved from the al-Nusra Front, which was originally affiliated with al-Qaeda. But in recent years, HTS has tried to rebrand itself, trying to come across as more moderate and nationalist, distancing themselves from their jihadist past.
Right. And they're the ones who put out that statement declaring victory and outlining their plans for the future of Syria.
Yeah. Indeed. The statement is quite something. It's a carefully crafted piece of propaganda blending promises of unity, stability, and reconciliation with thinly veiled threats against their opponents.
Of course, the Kiwi Farms crew wasn't buying any of it. One user, Mindless Observer, responded to each point of the HTS statement with pure sarcasm, predicting everything from ethnic cleansing to, well, let's just say things got pretty dark.
It's certainly a healthy dose of skepticism, which is always warranted in these types of situations.
Especially when you're dealing with a group that has a history of,
Less than savory activities.
Exactly.
Even if we take their claims of moderation at face value, their past actions raise serious concerns about their ability to govern justly and inclusively.
Oh, but let's be real. The real question on everyone's mind is where in the world is Assad? Did he actually flee the country? Like a rat deserting a sinking ship?
That seems to be the prevailing theory, although his exact whereabouts are still unknown. There's speculation he might be seeking refuge in Russia or Iran, his main backers during the conflict.
One Kiwi Farms user, it could be worse, chimed in with, Dr. Assad, I'm KGB, which, pretty much sums up the whole situation.
A classic meme indeed. But it also highlights the geopolitical implications of Assad's downfall. Russia has invested heavily in propping up his regime both militarily and financially. His removal from power is a major setback for their influence in the region.
So what does all this mean for the future of Syria? Is this the end of the conflict or just the beginning of like a whole new chapter of chaos?
That is the question everyone is asking, and unfortunately there's no easy answer. The situation is incredibly complex with a multitude of factors at play.
And of course, Kiwi Farms is the perfect place to watch it all unfold, with a running commentary that's somehow both hilarious and terrifyingly insightful.
They are certainly a unique source of information and entertainment.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
You know what? I'm starting to think everyone should have a Kiwi Farm subscription. Just imagine the dinner party conversations. Like, did you hear what John Badman said about Assad's potential plane crash
Yep.
and the difficulty of identifying his remains?
Well, maybe not everyone's cup of tea. But for those who appreciate a certain brand of dark humor and unfiltered commentary, it's definitely a treasure trove.
Speaking of treasure troves, let's dig into some of the factors that might have contributed to this whole sudden regime collapse. Because let's be real, no one saw this coming. Not even the prophets of doom over at Kiwi Farms.
You were right. For years, the Syrian civil war appeared to be locked in a stalemate, with neither side able to achieve a decisive victory. So what changed? Well, several factors likely played a role. And it's important to remember that these factors are all interconnected and often difficult to separate.
All right, let's untangle them. Give us the rundown on the key ingredients in this recipe for regime change. What brought the Assad souffle crashing down?
One key factor was the absolutely disastrous state of the Syrian economy, especially in government-controlled areas. Years of war, coupled with international sanctions, have led to widespread poverty, shortages of basic goods, and a complete collapse of infrastructure in many parts of the country.
I mean, it's one thing to deal with a brutal dictator, but when you can't even find bread to feed your family, that's when people really start to get restless.
Exactly. And this economic hardship probably played a major role in eroding support for the regime, even among those who might have previously been okay with Assad's rule.
One user, Enoch Emery, pointed out that the sanctions actually seem to have a much bigger impact on government-controlled areas, while places controlled by groups like HTS were actually doing relatively okay economically.
That's an interesting observation, and it highlights the unintended consequences of sanctions. While they're often intended to pressure regimes into changing their behavior, they can also have a disproportionate impact on ordinary citizens, sometimes even strengthening the very groups they are meant to weaken.
It's like trying to swat a fly with a sledgehammer.
A rather apt analogy. In this case, the economic disparity between regime-controlled areas and those controlled by the opposition might have actually incentivized people to switch sides, further weakening Assad's position.
So basically, Assad was playing a game of economic Jenga, and he pulled the wrong block.
In a sense, yes. The economic foundation of his regime had become so fragile that it simply couldn't withstand the pressure anymore.
And of course, we can't forget about the role of external support for the opposition. It's no secret that various regional and international actors have been meddling in the Syrian civil war for years, backing different factions and pursuing their own agendas.
Absolutely. The Syrian conflict has become a proxy war, with countries like Turkey, Saudi Arabia, Iran, Russia, and the United States all vying for influence and control. Any shift in the balance of power among these external actors can have a huge impact on the conflict.
So who was bankrolling the opposition this time around? Was there a sudden influx of cash and weapons from some shadowy foreign power?
The details are still unclear, but it's certainly possible that certain actors may have increased their support for the opposition in recent months. Perhaps they sensed that the Assad regime was becoming increasingly vulnerable.
And let's not forget about the whole morale factor. A user out in Thrain wondered if national demoralization within both the Syrian population and the Syrian Arab army played a large role in the regime's collapse.
That's a good point. Years of war, economic hardship, and political repression can really take a toll on the morale of a nation. When people lose faith in their government and their future, they become less willing to fight and die for a cause they no longer believe in.
And when your own army starts to lose faith, well, that's when you know you're in deep trouble.
Indeed. A demoralized army is far less effective on the battlefield. Soldiers who are hungry, poorly equipped, and disillusioned with their leadership are unlikely to put up much resistance against a determined enemy.
So it sounds like Assad's regime was facing a perfect storm of factors.
Yeah.
A crumbling economy, shifting external alliances, and a demoralized population and military. No wonder the whole thing imploded so quickly.
It was a confluence of events that even the most astute observers, including those on Kiwi Farms, didn't seem to anticipate.
Well, they might not have predicted it, but they sure had a lot of fun documenting the whole thing.
Makes you wonder, doesn't it, what goes through a dictator's mind when their carefully constructed world starts to fall apart around them.
Oh man, I bet Assad's internal monologue was just pure gold. Like, wait, you're not supposed to do that. I had tanks, chemical weapons. Where did I go wrong?
One can only imagine. That scramble for the exits when it all started to go south. Did he, grab a few family photos on the way out?
Yeah.
A lifetime supply of hair gel.
The world may never know.
Indeed.
Thankfully, we have the intrepid minds of Kiwi Farms to fill in the gaps, with their unique blend of speculation and dark humor.
Always.
One user, John Badman, made a pretty morbid joke about Assad potentially dying in a plane crash and the difficulties of, identifying his remains.
Oh my.
Just typical lighthearted Kiwi Farms fare.
Yes. Well, they certainly do have a knack for finding humor in the darkest of places. But, jokes aside, there is that genuine curiosity about Assad's fate, right? Has he truly fled the country like HTS claims? And if so, where has he gone? What's he planning? Is he plotting a comeback from some luxury bunker somewhere, stroking a white cat and muttering about revenge?
I'm picturing him on a beach somewhere, sipping a mojito, trying to blend in with the tourists. Maybe he grew a beard and is going by Barry now?
An amusing thought. Although it's probably more likely that he sought refuge with one of his allies. Perhaps Russia or Iran.
Speaking of allies, I can't help but wonder what's going through the minds of Assad's former backers right now. I bet Putin's throwing a tantrum in the Kremlin.
Oh.
All those years propping up the Assad regime, all that military hardware and political capital, and for what? To see him go down like a sack of potatoes?
It's definitely a significant setback for Russia's geopolitical goals in the Middle East. They've lost a crucial ally, a strategic foothold in the region, and a considerable amount of prestige on the world stage.
Wouldn't be surprised if Putin's got a whole team of analysts working around the clock to figure out how to salvage the situation. Maybe they'll try to install a puppet regime or find some other obscure faction within the Syrian opposition to back. Maybe they'll just say to hell with it and airlift a giant statue of Assad into Damascus as like a consolation prize or something.
Those scenarios are certainly entertaining to think about. It is important to remember, though, that the situation is still very much in flux. Very unpredictable. It's too early to say for sure what Russia's next move will be.
True. But one thing is certain. This whole regime change thing has really thrown a wrench into the geopolitical machinery of the Middle East. It's like someone dropped a live grenade into a game of chess.
A very apt analogy. The Syrian civil war has already destabilized the region, fueling refugee crises, terrorism, and proxy conflicts. And now the collapse of the Assad regime just adds another layer of complexity and uncertainty. It has the potential to completely redraw alliances, ignite new conflicts, and reshape the balance of power in the region.
It really is enough to make your head spin. But thankfully, we have the collective wisdom of Kiwi Farms to help us make sense of it all. Where else can you find comments like, they expect one of us in the wreckage, brother, alongside serious discussions about, the economic factors that led to the regime's downfall?
It's a truly remarkable blend. The absurd and the insightful. They might not always be right, but they're never boring.
And they definitely don't sugarcoat things.
Yeah.
Which brings us to the big question, what happens now?
Right.
With Assad out of the picture, who's going to fill the power vacuum?
That's what everyone wants to know. And the answer isn't clear at all. As we were talking about earlier, the Syrian opposition is really just a bunch of different groups with different ideologies and goals and allegiances, and they don't always get along.
It's like trying to herd cats, or maybe like a pack of rabid weasels.
Perhaps a slightly less chaotic metaphor would be a multi-headed hydra, each head representing a different faction, all vying for power. And cutting off one head doesn't necessarily solve the problem, as another one might just pop up in its place.
So we're potentially looking at a total free-for-all for control of Syria. Great.
It's certainly a possibility. There's a very real risk that the country could just spiral into even more chaos and violence.
And then there's the ever-present threat of outside interference. With so many countries having a stake in the outcome of the Syrian conflict, there's a good chance that some of them will try to take advantage of the situation.
Absolutely. The Syrian civil war has already become a proxy war, and there's no reason to think that that's going to change now that Assad is gone. In fact, the competition for influence and control might actually intensify.
So to sum it up, you've got a country in Rowan's a power vacuum, ripe for exploitation, a cast of characters that wouldn't be out of place in a Quentin Tarantino film,
Yeah.
and a whole lot of unanswered questions. This is like a recipe for a Kiwi Farms meltdown.
I'm sure they're already setting up betting pools on who will become the next dictator. My money's on whoever has the best memes.
Speaking of memes, let's take a look at that statement put out by HTS, the group that seems to have come out on top, at least for now. They're claiming victory, pledging to rebuild the country, and promising a brighter future for all Syrians. Are they being serious, or is this just some PR stunt?
Probably a bit of both. They're definitely trying to project an image of, moderation and responsibility. But looking at their past actions and their ideology, well, it makes you wonder about their real intentions.
And let's be honest, their track record is not exactly spotless. This is a group that came out of an al-Qaeda affiliate. I don't think a fresh coat of paint and a few carefully worded statements are enough to erase that.
You're right to be skeptical. It's important to remember that HTS is just one of many factions within the Syrian opposition. Just because they've won this round doesn't mean they're going to be able to control the whole country.
And of course, we can't forget about all the everyday Syrians who've been caught in the middle of this whole mess for over a decade. They've been through so much, lost loved ones, been forced from their homes, seen their country torn apart by violence. What does this change in leadership really mean for them? Is there hope for peace finally, or are they just trading one set of problems for another?
That is the most important question, and I'm afraid we don't have a clear answer right now. The situation is still developing, and there are just too many factors at play.
But one thing's for sure, we're going to need a bigger popcorn bowl to watch all of this play out. I wouldn't want to miss the Kiwi Farms commentary for anything. They might not have all the answers, but they'll definitely be the most entertaining and unfiltered source out there.
Absolutely. It's like having a front row seat to history in the making with a side of dark humor and internet slang. What more could you ask for?
Less real-world suffering would be nice. But hey, you can't have everything. You know, it's easy to get lost in all the geopolitics and the power struggles, but we can't forget about the human cost of all this.
Absolutely. For over a decade, the Syrian people have endured unimaginable suffering. Millions have been displaced from their homes, forced to become refugees in other countries, or just internally displaced within Syria itself.
Yeah.
The scars of this conflict are going to run deep. It'll take generations to heal.
It's a stark reminder that behind all the headlines and the memes and the analysis, there are real people whose lives have been completely upended by this war.
And they face a monumental task, now rebuilding a country that's been devastated by years of conflict. It's going to require so much more than just money. It's going to take political will, social cohesion, and a real commitment to reconciliation.
It's like trying to put together a jigsaw puzzle, but like half the pieces are missing and the other half are on fire.
A striking image, though perhaps a bit too pessimistic. While the challenges are certainly daunting, the Syrian people have shown incredible resilience, a real determination to rebuild their lives and their communities.
And there's been a lot of support from the international community, too. There are tons of organizations and individuals working hard to provide humanitarian aid, support refugees, and just try to promote peace and reconciliation in Syria.
That's true. But the international response has been kind of all over the place, to be honest. It's been underfunded and often held back by politics. We need to see a more coordinated effort, a more sustained effort to really address the humanitarian crisis and help Syria in the long term.
And of course, there's the whole issue of accountability for the atrocities that have been committed during the conflict. We're talking war crimes, crimes against humanity, chemical weapons attacks. I mean, the list goes on.
Justice and accountability are so important for healing, for reconciliation. But to achieve that in the context of this conflict, it's incredibly difficult.
Right.
There are so many obstacles, questions of jurisdiction, evidence, gathering political will.
It's a real mess. But you have to hope that with Assad gone, there might be at least a chance now to pursue justice and hold those responsible accountable.
It's a long shot, but it's not impossible. The International Criminal Court could potentially play a role even with its limitations. And there are other international mechanisms for transitional justice that might come into play.
Okay, speaking of transitions, let's talk about the political landscape of post-Assad Syria. We've talked about how the opposition is this very diverse and often divided group. Is there any chance they can actually come together and form a stable government, or we're just looking at more infighting and instability?
That's the question, isn't it? And unfortunately, only time will tell. There are definitely a lot of things that could stand in the way of a united and stable Syria. Ideological differences, personal rivalries, competition for resources, and of course, just the legacy of all that mistrust and violence.
It's like a giant game of Survivor, but with, way higher stakes.
Perhaps a slightly less cynical analogy would be to say that it's like a puzzle, a very complex puzzle with a lot of missing pieces. But there are pieces there, and if they can figure out how to fit them together, there's a chance they can create something new.
Something better.
Right. And let's not forget about the potential role of civil society in shaping the future of Syria. Despite everything they've been through, the repression, the violence, Syrian activists, journalists, artists, ordinary citizens, they've continued to demand change to work towards a better future.
That's true.
They are the real heroes of this story, and their voices need to be heard as the country moves forward.
It's going to be a long and difficult road ahead. But there's one thing we've learned from this whole Syrian conflict. It's that even in the darkest of times, there's still room for for hope, for resilience, and for the unexpected.
The human spirit can endure extraordinary things. And as for Kiwi Farms, well, they'll be there to provide their own unique commentary, keeping us entertained, informed, and maybe even a little bit wiser.
So to wrap things up, what's the one thing you want our listeners to take away from all of this?
I think the biggest takeaway is that while the fall of Assad is a major turning point, it's not the end of the story. The Syrian people have a lot to overcome, and the future is far from certain, but there is hope. And with the support of the international community, hopefully they can build a more peaceful and prosperous future.
Well said. And to our listeners, we encourage you to stay informed, stay engaged, and don't forget about the human cost of this conflict. And if you ever need a break from all the heaviness, well, you know where to find a little dark humor and internet absurdity. Just take it all with a grain of salt.
And maybe a shot of something strong.
Exactly. Thanks for joining us for another deep dive. Until next time, stay curious, stay informed, and stay hydrated.